Welcome to Today's Walk with Dr. Roger Spradlin from Valley Baptist Church, the program helping you to understand the Bible today.
Welcome to Today's Walk. I'm Kate Neighbors here with Pastor Roger. Now we're going to continue our series looking at the Ten Commandments. And one thing that strikes me about all of the Ten Commandments is that they were written how many thousands of years ago, but yet it's so applicable for what we're going through today. So what are we going to be looking at?
This one certainly is.
Yeah.
It's about not committing adultery, which the positive principle is that of sexual purity.
Yeah. So let's jump in and watch part one of the principle of sexual purity.
Exodus 20:14, you shall not commit adultery. Now I recognize that adultery is a rather unusual topic for a Sunday morning sermon. But when you think about it, this commandment made God's top 10. I think all of us would probably agree that it's extremely relevant in our culture today. In 1631, there was a new edition at that time of the King James Version or translation of the Bible. It quickly gained the nickname, the Wicked Bible. Now, normally we don't associate the word wicked and Bible together. That's like an oxymoron. But the reason it was called the Wicked Bible is because the printer had left out a single word in the entire Bible. But it was very strategic and a very important word, and it happened to be in this verse. The King James, or the Authorized translation, is thou shalt not commit adultery. He left out the word not. And it said you shall commit adultery. And so they called it the Wicked Bible. And it became a very expensive collector's edition to this very day. But when you think about it, we live in a culture where sexual sin has become so pervasive that it seems like many people prefer the Wicked Bible to the real thing. Not only is this commandment violated regularly in our culture, but it's even lampooned, ridiculed, and scorned. You see that on late night television with comedians, and everything from movies to sitcoms to talk shows promote adultery as being somehow accepted. People today in our culture, they may talk about the importance in relationships of monogamy, but in our culture, that doesn't really mean the same thing as it does in the Bible. The Bible speaks of one man and one woman for a lifetime. Well, when our culture speaks of monogamy, it means that you're to be loyal to the one that you're with right now. So our culture has adopted kind of a serial polygamy, that you move from one relationship to another, and that's okay as long as you're loyal to the one that you're with right now. Now, the principle behind this commandment is one of sexual purity. But I think the verse also speaks to the significance and the importance of marriage. To really understand God's intention in marriage, we have to go way back to the beginning, all the way back to creation. God created the world, and then He created the first man, the first woman, Adam and Eve, and He placed them in this idyllic setting of a garden. Now, at first He only created Adam, but then He created Eve, and when Adam saw Eve, here's what he said in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. I think he may have said wow before this, but he said this. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now in the New Testament, Jesus was routinely questioned about marriage and divorce, just like every pastor in modern times is routinely questioned about those issues. When he was facing some rather tough questions one time, he quoted this particular verse out of Genesis as the basis for marriage. And when you look at this verse in Genesis, it's controlled really by 3 verbs, and all of them are very significant. The last one is that they shall become one flesh, become. That's really the purpose of marriage, to become one. In Genesis chapter 2, in verse number 20, it says, "So Adam gave names to all the cattle, to all the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper comparable to him." This is before Eve was created. Evidently, God paraded all the animals before Adam and asked Adam to name them. So he goes, "Well, that's a hippopotamus." Well, what else could it be? I mean, come on. That's what it is, right? So he gives names to all the animals, but there was not found anyone to be a companion for Adam that could solve the problem of loneliness. God, when he'd created Adam before Eve, he said, "It is not good that man should be alone." So he created Eve. So that was really the purpose of marriage, that they become one. Not only one physically, but emotionally one and spiritually one. Now, there have been those throughout history that have said, well, the purpose of marriage is simply procreation. But that reduces marriage to legalized mating. That's not the primary purpose of marriage. The purpose of marriage was to solve the problem of loneliness for man and for woman. So the verb become speaks of the purpose of marriage. But then there's another verb. He says you are to leave your father and mother. That speaks of the priority of marriage. Now, when he says leave your father and mother, does that mean when you get married that you geographically have to leave, that you have to move far away? Well, it may mean that sometimes. But does it mean you have to leave emotionally? Absolutely, it means that. There is to be this interdependence that's developed within marriage. Now, the third verb that he uses is joined, which speaks of the permanence of marriage. It is the word mortar, our word mortar, that you put between bricks to hold them together. It would be our word for glue. And yet we live in a culture where people say, well, you know, I got to do what's best for me. And people say, I've got to do what makes me happy. But the reality, marriage is not just about happiness, although I hope those of you who are married have a happy marriage. And marriage is not even just about love, although I hope that you learn to love one another. Marriage ultimately is about commitment. It's a covenant between two individuals. It's really a triangular covenant between a man, a woman, and God. But we live in this culture that wants to escape from our covenants and wants to escape so easily from our commitments. So people seem to be always trying to find a way to dissolve what God has said is to be permanent. Now, I want us to think about what God has said about the violation of this command. Since it's one of the 10 commandments, you shall not commit adultery, that means adultery is sin. It is disobedience to God. The Bible is clear about that. Adultery was sin 4,000 years ago when Moses went up on the mountain and God told him, write these things down. 2,000 years ago when Jesus reaffirmed this commandment, adultery was sin. 1,000 years from now, if Jesus hasn't come back, adultery will still be sin. But people say, whoa, you don't understand my situation. We are so unhappy in our marriage. And this other person, they make me so happy. Well, God is concerned about our happiness, but he's way more concerned about our holiness and our obedience. We are now living in what I term a sinless society. I mean by that, nothing seems to be sin in our culture. We live in a culture where everyone views themselves as a victim on one level or another, maybe a victim of a relationship. Or we live in a culture of addictions. People end up in adultery and they say, well, you know, it's because I have a sexual addiction. Our culture says what everyone needs is recovery. What God says is we need redemption. We need forgiveness. So I want to be absolutely clear, adultery is sin. Yet, the New Testament speaks in broader terms than just adultery regarding sexual sin. In the New Testament, there's a word that is used that we sometimes translate, the Authorized Version translates it fornication. Adultery is technically when someone cheats on their spouse. Fornication, that's translated that, is a broader word, and it speaks to sexual sin, which includes adultery, but also includes premarital sex or any kind of sexual relationship outside of biblical marriage. Now, I want us to see what Jesus said about this commandment. We can talk about, well, it means this, it means that, but Jesus gave an extensive commentary on this commandment in the Sermon on the Mount. So let's see what he said about it. This is in Matthew 5, verse 27. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. That's Exodus chapter 20. We read that. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is talking about more than the technicality of adultery. He's talking about the principle of sexual purity. But then he goes on and he says something that is pretty radical in the next verse. Listen to it, verse 29. If your right eye causes you to sin, it's in the context of lust, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it's more profitable that one of your members perish than your whole body to be cast into hell. Jesus certainly intensified this commandment, didn't he? He's teaching that it's not just technically about adultery, it's about sexual sin, whether it's fantasy or pornography. And then he tells us how serious it is. If your eye offends you, then just pluck it out. Does that mean that we're literally supposed to gouge out our eye? Thankfully, no, or there'd be a lot of guys with patches on today. It is hyperbole, but it may mean that you need to monitor your internet intake. Put a filter on your internet or on your browser. It may mean that you need to get rid of certain stations that you might have on cable television, or be careful what you stream. In the New Testament, Jesus said, he gave us one exception for divorce. He taught that you're not to divorce except, he said, in the case of infidelity. That doesn't mean you have to divorce if there's infidelity. I've dealt with many couples that there was infidelity that broke their marriage and they were able to put it back together through forgiveness. But adultery so violates the marriage covenant that it frees you. You don't have to divorce, but you can without sin. Now, when it says except for adultery, the Greek word there that we translate adultery is the Greek word porneia. We just transliterated it into English and we get our word pornography from it. Graphic is writings of sexual things. So it's a very broad word for sexual sin. Now, contextually, I think it's clearly talking about adultery. Sexual sin violates and fractures the marriage covenant. Now, as we think today about adultery, here's the first principle that I want to give you. Adultery is a sin against oneself. Now, we don't think of it that way, but it is, according to God. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, it says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? You were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. Sometimes people say, well, it doesn't matter what I do regarding my body. All that matters is my heart. Well, yes, it does matter. That's Gnosticism, which is a heresy from the New Testament era. Sexual sin is an offense against the Holy Spirit. God says it's a sin against your own body. You cannot commit a sin that is more destructive than sexual immorality. It causes broken homes, it wrecks lives, it sometimes even causes disease and death. It unleashes a guilt within your life that will rob you of even the possibility of sustained joy. It's so destructive. But here's the second principle. Adultery is a sin against your mate. You cannot commit a crueler sin. There cannot be a greater act of betrayal than to stand in front of someone that you say that you love and make a vow that you're going to love them, you're going to cherish them, you're going to honor them until death does you part, and then you betray them in this act of selfishness. Here's the third principle. Adultery is a sin against your children. It's a sin that rips children apart. Even when they don't even know what's going on, it affects them. Sometimes people will write down a prayer request for me, and as a pastor. And there was one that I remember from many years ago, because it was obviously from a little child, because it was in big block letters. And the prayer request said, "Pray that my daddy will forgive my mama so she can come home. She committed adultery," it said. That child probably didn't even know what adultery was. And you know what's sadder? Maybe they did know. There's something sad about the effect of sexual sin in a family for a child. When I travel by airplane, I always try to share my faith with the person seated next to me. Number one, it's like a captive audience, you know what I mean? Where are they going to go? They can't go outside. Number two, I view it as providential that God placed this person next to me. So a few years ago, I was traveling. I don't know if I was preaching somewhere or what. I was going across the country. And there was a woman that sat next to me. And at first, we were just kind of small talk. And I tried to steer it towards spiritual things. And I thought I had this tremendous opportunity, because I noticed as soon as she sat down, she had a book that she'd been carrying with her that she was obviously reading and interested in. And the title of it was The God of Small Things. So I thought, well, this would be the end. Turned out the book was on Hinduism, so it didn't help me as much as I thought. But we had a really interesting conversation for about an hour and a half. She was from San Francisco, and she was really searching for truth. There was a point in the conversation where she began to open up to me about her life. She was 51 years old, and she told me how just recently her father, who was up in his 70s, had left her mother for another woman. And this 51-year-old woman took off her glasses, wiped tears from her eyes as they streamed down her cheeks. Her life was being wrecked by the sin of adultery by a father who was up in his 70s. Someone has said, there are seldom whole eggs in a broken nest. Sexual immorality tears children's lives apart. It's a sin against yourself. It's a sin against your spouse. It's a sin against your children. But here's the next principle. Adultery is a sin against your church. Sometimes people say, well, it's no one's business as long as we're consenting adults. Well, you know what? It's my business. If you're a believer, we are part of one another. We're connected. The church, in some ways, as far as its influence, is the sum total of the strengths and weaknesses of its members. And the church in America has grown very anemic. It's very weak. And I think it's weak because, to some degree, because of the unholy lifestyles many times of its members. We are tied together. We are members one of another. Our behavior and the depth of our commitment affects all of us as a church. But then the last principle about adultery is by far the most important. It is this: adultery is ultimately a sin against God. David committed a grievous sexual sin. David, the great king of Israel, the sweet psalmist, gave us so many of the songs of the Old Testament. Terrible, horrible sexual sin. He eventually repented, and he cried out to God for forgiveness, and God restored him. His prayer is recorded for us. It's Psalm 51. I want to read one verse for you. In verse number 4, he's speaking to God. He says, against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight. Well, David said, God, against you I've sinned. David had sinned against his wife. David sinned, I think, against Bathsheba because he was the king. He was in a position of power. He probably used that in manipulation, and we'd call it sexual abuse today. He sinned against Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba. It was a sin against Israel. He was the king. But ultimately, David recognized that his sexual sin was against God, because it was God out in the Sinai desert that had drawn a line, a proverbial line in the sand, and said, you shall not commit adultery. Now imagine with me, if this sin grieves little children, if this sin hurts the heart of a pastor that deals with it, imagine what it does to the great holy heart of God. It's treating God with contempt. It's shaking our fist in the face of God and saying, I'll have it my way. Truth does not matter. Now, because it's a sin against God, there are consequences from God. Hebrews 13, verse 4, marriage is honorable above all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Sometimes people live in secret sin, and they're so careful. They say, no one knows. God always knows. Some people think, well, no one knows what I'm looking at on the internet. No one knows what's in my mind. God always knows.
That was part one of a message looking at the principle of sexual purity. If you want to see part two, you got to join us next week. So you made a lot of great statements. Like I said in the opener, this is a very on point for our culture right now. And you talked about how sin is not just, how adultery is not just a sin against us, but it's a sin against our mate, and it's a sin against our kids.
Well, it really is. And I tried to illustrate that and bring biblical support of all those points. But ultimately, Kate, and we don't think of this sometimes, we think of how it affects us and our family, and that's pretty natural. Ultimately, it's a sin against God.
Yeah.
And we see that with David. He committed adultery with a woman by the name of Bathsheba. And I think he sinned against Bathsheba in the sense that he was the king. It was an unequal relationship. We would call it sexual abuse probably today. He certainly sinned against Bathsheba's husband, Uriah.
Right.
He had him killed, for goodness sake. But when we read his prayer of confession in Psalm 51, he says to God, against you and you only have I sinned, which is a strong statement. It's overstated, obviously, for the effect of us understanding that God is the lawgiver. God is the one that laid out this principle for us. And when we violate it, it's not just that it's going to have consequences. Our marriage is going to break up. Our children are going to have a rough time. That we're not living up to what God created us to be, that He created us with a certain plan, and we have violated that plan. It's kind of like, I remember when my children were small, on Christmas Eve, putting together their toys.
Yeah.
And I would never read the directions. And so I'd get it together and end up with 4 pieces left. And it's kind of the same, when all else fails, read the directions. This is the directions for life.
Yeah.
About sexual purity and about marriage. And so we somehow think as a culture and as individuals that we cannot follow the directions and life will turn out the same way, that we will still have happiness and fulfillment. No, we won't. If we don't follow God's plan, we can't expect God's blessing. Yes. That's the reality.
It is. And I think that's a reality that a lot of people don't come to terms with, because we're all inherently selfish, right?
We are.
Because we think about ourselves and we think about how this benefits me or how this messes up my life, but we don't think about the higher purpose of the calling that God has in our lives. Yeah. We just think about us, right? So much so that a lot of times, especially in these situations, we don't think about how this particular sin affects our family and affects other people around us. Yeah. It's just a me, I thing.
But even that, if we would recognize it is going to affect us in a negative way. Yes. It's not just a positive way. People think, well, this is going to make me happy. No, not in the long term. It's not. No. It's going to destroy your chance at happiness and your chance at peace. And a lot of that's as you watch out the consequences in the life of your children. And I've been the pastor at the same church long enough. I've seen the consequence into generations of the effect of sexual sin. And it's not a pretty thing. it's a horrible sin in our culture. It's a horrible sin in a family, and it's passed on sometimes from fathers to sons so easily.
Yeah.
And it's just, this of all the commandments is one of the most devastating as far as its consequences.
Oh, yeah. I would agree with you, because especially when we look at right now and what our culture has to say about sexual sin as a whole, it is self-focused.
Right.
So we're not thinking about how this affects other people, and it's all muddy. You know, it's muddy because we hear this narrative of be happy, but we don't necessarily think about, are we really that happy, or would we? I mean, happy is different, and I think it brings up a larger idea that, and one of the reasons why I think you've done such a great job of spinning the 10 Commandments in a positive light, is a lot of times we think rules are stagnant and stiff and not fun and keep us from living our best life, right? Yeah. But the reality is the rules, the law, the Bible has been given to us so that we can have a fulfilled life, so we can live out our ultimate purpose, which is having a relationship with Christ and helping him grow his kingdom by telling others about Jesus.
If you're on a long bridge and you're traveling and there's guardrails on either side, those guardrails aren't just to restrict you. They're to keep you from going off.
You don't jump over the guardrail because, I don't walk between the lines.
They're to keep you from going off the cliff. And God has set these guardrails in our life not to restrict our happiness, but to give us liberty within life to enjoy the gifts of marriage and sexuality and all the good things that God has given us. And somehow our cultures miss that and think that they have the right to redefine God's plan. But we're not the architect. We're just the workers.
Yes.
And God is the architect of what a life should look like, and we have to learn to follow that.
Yeah. So we have unpacked a lot of ideas and talked a lot about a lot of different things around this idea of sexual purity. And I am sure you have questions. There is a website, todayswalk.org. We would love to hear from you, help you open up the Bible and break down the things that we're talking about today. Even give you a free copy of today's message or any of our messages so that we could help you understand your Bible today. Definitely join us next week for part 2. This has been Today's Walk.
Today's Walk is the broadcast ministry of Valley Baptist Church. This program is supported directly by our church members and viewers like you. You'll find plenty of great resources when you call us or visit our website. Thank you for watching, and join us again next week for Today's Walk from Valley Baptist Church in Bakersfield, California.